When you define and manage your preferences in an activity, those preferences are saved in something called the default preference set. I'll show you how to access that preference set, and I'll also show you how to listen for changes to any preference set. In this version of the application, I've added a new layout file called griditem.xml. It places the item image above, and it places the text view below. And I'll be using this for a 3-column grid display. Now, in the main activity, I'll go to my onCreate method, and I'll add code right here before I call the recycler view. I'll create an instance of the shared preferences class. I'll name it settings, and I'll get its reference with this code. I'll use a class named preference manager and call getDefaultSharedPreferences, and pass in this as the context. Now I want to find out whether the user wants to display things in a grid. That's a Boolean value. It was a checkbox in the settings screen, and I'll just name it grid, and I'll get its value like this, with settings.getBoolean, and then I need to pass in a string as a key. I saved my key, though, as a resource, which is an integer, so I'll call the getString method, and then I'll pass in r.string.prefDisplayGrid. Just as before, when I was working completely in Java, I need to provide a default value that will be returned if this preference isn't found, and I'll pass in a value of false. So now I can find out as the activity starts up what the user wants to see. And in the main activity class, I'll implement that by adding an if condition right here. And if the grid value is true, then I'll override the default layout manager of the recycler view, which I had set to a linear layout manager in the XML file. I'll say recyclerView.setLayoutManager, and then I'll pass in a new instance of a class named GridLayoutManager. I'll use a very simple version of this. I'll pass in this as the context, and a value of 3 for the span count. In this environment, that will create a display with 3 columns. Now I'll run the app, and it's not going to look quite right yet. You'll see that the image is to the left and the text is to the right, just like in the list. But I can show you that the settings are working. I'll go into my settings screen and uncheck this option, and then go back, and I'm back to the list. And then I'll change it again, and I'm back to a 3-column display. To make this look right, I need to switch to a different layout file for each item in the recycler view. So I'll go back to Android Studio, and I'll go to the DataItemAdapter class. In the onCreateViewHolder method, I'm currently using the list item layout file. Once again, I want to read the shared preferences and react appropriately. I'll come back to the main activity class, and I'll just select and copy these 2 lines of code. I'll come back here, and I'll paste that code in right at the top. Now here's one change I need to make right away. The DataItemAdapter is not extended from context, so I need to replace this with an actual context, and I'll use mContext, the field that I had saved as the adapter was created. The same thing is going to be the case with the getString method. I'll prefix that with mContext, and I'll add some line feeds here to make this a little bit more readable. Okay, so now I know whether the user wants to see a grid. So my next step is to decide which layout file I'm going to use. And I'll use a little bit of conditional code. I'll create an integer value that I'll call layout ID, and I'll get its value by starting with the grid value, that's true or false, and then I'll use the shorthand for conditional code in Java. I'll put in a question mark, and then I'll pass in r.layout.gridItem, and then after a colon, r.layout.listItem. And then down here where I'm inflating the item, instead of passing in the literal ID, I'll pass in the new variable, layout ID. So that's all of the logic in the DataItemAdapter. So I'm going to run the app again and see what happens. I'll go back a step and totally exit the application to make sure that it's totally reloading all of the new resources. And then I'll fire it up again, and there's my 3-column display. It works exactly the same as it did before. That is, when the user touches an item, they see the details for that item. And you can also go back to the list display by going to the settings, deselecting the checkbox, and now you'll be back to the original display. So that's how easy it is to read default preferences. These preferences are shared among the entire application, but are not available outside the application. They're always private. And you can add as many preferences as you want, and they'll be stored persistently as long as the user doesn't delete their values. But watch what happens when the user does that. I'll go back and click Display in Grid, and then I'll exit all this. Then I'll go to my app list. I'll click and hold on the app icon and drag it up to App Info. I'll click on Storage, and then I'll clear the data. And the user doesn't need any special admin rights to do this. It's quite easy. Then I'll go back to the home screen, and I'll launch the app again. And I'll see that the settings are back to defaults. The same thing will happen with SQL-like databases and anything else that's left in internal storage. I'll talk more about internal and external storage in the next chapter of the course when I talk about file management. But understanding these concepts is important as you're working with shared preferences and other data storage mechanisms. Finally, I'll show you how to listen for changes to a shared preference set. You'll need an onChange listener, and you should always declare the listener object as a persistent field of your activity. That's because if you create it as an anonymous object, as you might do with, say, a click listener, it'll be a weak reference. And because you're navigating away from this activity and back again, that reference can be lost. It can be garbage collected. So I'll start up here, and I'm going to add a new private field, and I'll give it a type of onSharedPreferenceChange and I'll name it prefsListener. Then I'll go down to my onCreate method, and I'll add a bit of code here after I've declared the settings variable. First, I'll create the listener object. I'll start with prefsListener equals new, and then the type will be onSharedPreferenceChangeListener, and that generates a method named onSharedPreferenceChanged. I'll complete that statement, and then in this method, I'll get a shared preference reference, and I'll get a string-based key, and that will be the key to whatever preference changed. And all I'm going to do here is use a bit of logcat output and show you the key that changed. I'll change the tag here to just a string of preferences. Now I need to register this listener with the appropriate preferences set. I'll call settings.registerOnSharedPreferenceChangeListener, and I'll pass in the listener object. And now every time any value changes in that preference set, I'll be notified. And I'll run the app again. I'm going to totally exit the app so I can make sure I'm reloading everything from scratch. Then I'll open the app, and I'll go into the settings, and I'll check the checkbox, and then I'll exit, and I'll see the grid. I'll click Settings again and uncheck the checkbox and return. And then I'll go back to Android Studio, and I'll open up the logcat view and type in Preferences, so I'm only seeing the messages that have that tag, and there are the events. Now I can use that key, and I can look up the value from the shared preferences object that's passed in and take whatever action I need to take to modify the user interface or any of the behavior of my application.